Okay, John Paul.
Yeah. I'm not going to add. I'm going to add something to this from the electoral, political side of things. And that being said, a lot of regional governments are appointed, and so influencing directly and removing people from the ballot box makes it a little more difficult. But most areas don't have regional governments yet, and local governments can be influenced directly through electoral challenges and things of that nature. That being said, I just want to point out a few things. Kind of maybe put this in perspective why this isn't like an impossible task. Kathy started to point this out. One of the things we talk about at our training schools is that you have 100% of an electorate, or 100% of the people within a given district. How many of those do you really need to influence to win your issue? Not many in reality, because of that 100%, how many are even eligible to vote? And of those that are eligible to vote, how many are even registered to vote? Right there, you've lopped off maybe 40 to 60% of your district. Then the question is, how many of those are committed one way or another already? Because you don't need to waste your time on them either. Typically, you've got your, just talking about simple political partisan stuff, you've got your crazy R's and your crazy D's, and they'll vote. Saddam Hussein could run on either ticket and he'd win just because he had an R or a D next to him. Okay. Now, that being said, that lops off another about 10% from either side that show up each time, and this is a 10% of the whole pie. What ultimately, what everyone talks about is the middle. You see on CNN, Inside Politics, they say like the 30% of, it's kind of BS. Of people that actually show up and vote, it's really somewhere between 3 and 5% of the whole pie, of the 100% of the people in a given district. The key there then is you might be a small grassroots organization. You've got a few committed members, now you're building. Where do you move the fulcrum and exert force and pressure so that you can make a difference? Well, it's in identifying that 3 to 5% of the population methodically. There are ways to methodically identify those who may be persuadable. Ways this can be done. Before I get to ways this can be done, a lot of also times that I'll point out is local government elections are often, not in all areas, but not even connected to November presidential elections. A lot of times they're March or spring elections, where turnout is even more suppressed. I mean, the mayor of Fort Lauderdale was elected in this major metro area with like 17,000 votes. I mean, you're talking, this is a small number of people, and how many of those were already made up their mind beforehand, so then you're even going to a further smaller section of the populace. So that being said, there are manageable numbers in here that we have to understand that exist. There are, and that now that we know this is a concept, it's how to find them. It's where to look. A couple points on this is places. First off, you want to, in any public policy battle, you want to make sure your committed people are going to show up. Now, one way on the partisan end of things is this is on this issue, this cuts partisan lines. There's Dems and there's Republicans that are a mix of this in terms of some are, you got the Paul Weyrichs of the world who would be a raging conservative but is totally wrong on this, and then you've got hardcore Dems that are totally right on this. So, right there, Pat. So a lot of the typical ways of identifying these people go somewhat out the window. That being said, canvassing, door-to-door, and phone banking are initial ways that you can start to try to identify people. You don't want to waste your time. Automatically, you're not calling anybody who's not eligible to vote, not registered to vote, and then the registered people, you're only contacting people who voted in previous elections, not presidential, that's a lot of people, but if you have a March election where your local government is influenced or chosen, okay, you want to find out who voted in the last 2, 3, or 4 local government elections in March, because you compare apples to apples. You don't compare apples to oranges. Okay? It's those people who are, right off the bat, history is the best predicator of the future, and finding out who voted before is a good way of understanding who's voting in the future. So that's your list initially to start working with. And all of a sudden you've got a multi-million metro areas cut down to several thousand of these people that actually showed up to vote in that. Now you're canvassing these people and finding out where they stand on the issue. That is I'm just talking about in the electoral process of where you're going to exert where you're moving the fulcrum and where you're applying the pressure. Now, as far as moving more into why all politics is personal, there's lots of ways to influence and grassroots lobby people. Now, lobbyists will do, high-paid lobbyists will do certain things, or lobbyists in general for companies or whatnot will try to influence by reason or by influence of any number of cases. But as a grassroots organization, your influence is in people power. Your influence is in numbers of letters. Letters, as was already said, letters, handwritten letters are great. You can actually, if you build your membership list, provide for people some canned talking points that they can write into their letters, asking them to write letters. Letters to the editor of newspapers. One of the most highly read parts of a newspaper is after the funny pages, is the letters to the editor. So most people don't read the actual editorial page itself. They just read what other people like themselves are complaining about. So that being said, letters to the editor are very valuable. What you're trying to demonstrate is what's called a concept of organized spontaneity. This idea that this seems organized, but this is just spontaneous outpouring of like opposition to this. Well, it's entirely organized, of course, but they don't know that because they're getting this letter from, Mrs. Jones over on this side of town, and Mrs. Smith on this side of town, and Mr. So-and-so here, and there's handwritten notes, and they're written differently, arguing for the same idea. That is powerful. It's also powerful for media attention in trying to gain influence in local newspapers and things of that nature. Writing, contacting. I'll say this as a former reporter. Almost all the time you get, press releases through email or fax and things like that, and oftentimes they're circularly filed in the garbage. And as an organization starting out, a grassroots organization, one of the things that you can separate yourself is sending a non-extraordinarily time-sensitive press release through the mail in a weird-shaped envelope, handwritten address, multiple stamps. This sounds very strange. Why would you do that? Well, the reason is as a reporter, I go through, first off, who sends press releases through the mail anymore? Not many people, so it's going to be noticed. Second, who sends me mail anyways? Not many people, except bill collection agencies and what have you. Another thing is stuff I get in the mail looks like bills. I don't want to look at stuff like that. If you open your mailbox and you pull out of your mailbox a bunch of number 10 envelopes, these normal, and all of a sudden you get this weird envelope that's maybe cream, and then it's handwritten, and there's like 4 stamps on it, adding up to 37, and you're like, what the heck is that? You're going to open that and you're going to read it. The object is obviously to get them to. Hey, you can have all the great message you want, but they just throw the thing in the garbage. It does no good. So, just a few tips on trying to get people to get their attention. Other suggestions. Organize as your organization gets larger. You can actually, hopefully, if you can organize a phone bank. Realtor offices are great locations to organize a phone bank. If anybody's done a local campaign of any sort, a realtor office has oftentimes like a Long and Foster or a Reeve Max or something like that. They'll have their agents have they just got cubes all over the place and phones all over the place. And these guys oftentimes might be like-minded with you. Okay, after hours, they don't, or on slow days, they might not they might be able to loan you several of their phones. You bring in your volunteers, you flood the phone bank, and you got like 10 people making calls simultaneously, okay? And you don't have to pay to set up this phone bank, and it's something that's already existing. And the biggest thing about phone banking is if you just ask your people, you give them a list and say, go home and call somebody, call these people. They're not going to do it. Even the most dedicated person is going to find some other reason to do it. It's this herd instinct that we all have. When we're in groups and other people are doing this, you'll do it. People study in a library because students study in a library a lot of times because if they study in their frat house, nobody else is studying, and it's kind of hard to do. They have to be in a place where other people are doing it. So, anyways, those are just a few suggestions. Ultimately, there's something called the Lincoln four-step, which is a real basic concept that, oddly enough, Abe Lincoln came up with. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but this is his grassroots. This was Lincoln's grassroots way of winning an election, and it's still used today. It's identify, obtain a list. Step one was obtain a list of all eligible voters, of all registered voters rather. Then determine which ones are Whigs, which one of them were Whigs. Then determine with certainty for whom each one would vote. And then work with the undecideds and get all the Whigs to the polls. Simple four-step process of winning an election. There's all sorts of training in schools that elaborate on this, but it's still used today. So in a grassroots environment, in a March election, a city, a multi-million metro area, you're talking 18,000 people determined who won, who became mayor of that city. So it's canvassing that list, calling people, finding out who they're voting for. Once you get somebody who's a supporter, you put them into your database. The no's you put into your database to ignore for the rest of the time. And then you find all the undecideds, and you make a database of them and communicate to them on what they're undecided on, so that you can convince them. Now, once you've created this list and you've worked with your undecideds, your goal is actually within the 72 hours. You've heard of the 72-hour task force, perhaps. This idea that the GOP has done to really professionalize this process. They've identified as many of these people as possible, and now they're going to actually turn those people into votes and making sure that they show up. And in an election that's decided by a few percent, 10%, whatever it is, and with low turnout, you can have an amazing impacts. So this is not rocket science, and it can be overwhelming, especially when you're talking about, wow, my city's got several 100,000 people in it. How am I going to? Well, there's ways to whittle it down. So, anyways, that's generally what I have to say. And any other lobbying techniques with non-elected officials would be find out who's the elected official that's responsible for them, for one. For two, with them, obviously, communicate on a personal level, as has already been said. That can be done through the letters and the phone calls and the organized spontaneity that we're talking about here. So,
at the just a minute, at the regional government level, what this I think indicates is the crucial nature of understanding who you're dealing with. In the case of the Metropolitan Council here, you're dealing with appointees and board members, and you should be able to deal with them. Or if you're at the Metro in Portland, you're dealing with elected officials, and obviously you know how to deal with them. The problem is, for the most part, and I may be wrong, Stephen is perhaps a little bit different because he's on the board representing the transit agency, but a lot of these councils of governments are really councils of elected officials. So that
they're all elected.
Yeah, so you've got the mayor of Newport, perhaps, and the mayor of Sharonville, and the mayor of Cincinnati, or a councilman. And so a lot of these people who are on this board, not because they were elected to this board, but because they were elected somewhere else, you may have ways to get at them. And it strikes me also that it's crucial, and I don't know how it works because all these organizations will work differently, but as Stephen would certainly know, being on one of these boards, there will be opinion leaders among the members of the board. And I wouldn't be surprised if you look at the various committees where the work is done, there are board members that actually do take a very active role in the decision-making process and probably drive decisions, oftentimes just supporting the staff. But what about
For the most part, the people who are on the boards or on the committees are the people who want to be on the committees. And so you tend to get a fairly high level of interest in what's going on. Now, there are some exceptions to that. For instance, ODOT has to be at every one of those meetings. So, again, their paid person shows up and he's there, or she is, in the case of Diane. And then the city has its engineering department. They take a pretty active hand in most of these because they're directly involved, so they're active. But you did touch on something there also, and that is that, and I was alluding to it in the reference to the rawhide mentality of turning the herd. There's only a couple of people in these groups that are leading this. The light rail issue, for instance, the vast majority of the people on there just simply kind of went along because that's what they were being told was the plan. And suddenly I'm coming along and making a lot of noise and bringing some embarrassment to them and pointing out the fact that my favorite tagline was always, "They're back." You know, well, we just defeated it, but your friends at OKI don't care what you say. And these guys, they're showing up at this and they're getting a little embarrassed by the whole thing. It's getting uncomfortable for them. So quietly, they took the director and moved him out of town on a rail. And that's how he ended up disappearing all of a sudden in the dead of night, and his 5-year contract ended being, they bought him out early. But no, on the committees, you'll find that the people that are on the committees are interested in this process, and they, for the most part, at least that's been my experience thus far, and I've been on 3 of them, or on 2 now, and I was on a 3rd. And there's a lot at stake on those, and the decisions that are being made. That was my purpose in being here. Also this week, I met with URS here in downtown Minneapolis, where Rick now, who's conducting this study for us, is located with his office. He's vice president here. And now all of a sudden, some of the board members on that, the 7 members of the Uptown study, went to Portland somehow mysteriously, and now they want us to study a streetcar for Uptown. Now we're at the stage now where we're trying to figure out what the problem is, but we already know what the solution is. Does this sound familiar? It's going to be a streetcar filled with desire, and you know, and I'm having a conversation with him, and I'm saying, but tell me now, is there going to be any difference between this and a bus? And he says, no. They're both going to perform the same in terms of speed and time. Of course, one's $10 million a mile and whatever. But maybe what we need is a circular. Yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll just go in a circle up there. We have 350,000 car trips in and out of the Uptown area every day. But what we need is just something that goes in a circle. Then people could just move inside the circle and they wouldn't have to drive in and out of Uptown. But there's just no housing yet. Well, the rail will attract them. That's what they said in Portland.
Yeah,
they will come, yeah. So I'm deviating here, but the point that I'm making is that out of 7 board members, we now have 2 of them who have now accepted the religion experience, and they are, and the guy that I hired, I and 2 others hired to do the study, is now forced to study the streetcars because he's got 2 of the board members insisting that be part of the study. So,
yeah, the point is that you've got these organizations are as different as they can be. You need to really look at how they are locally. It sounds like some of your technical committees may not even include real board members. May just largely be staffs from engineering departments, etc.
As I'm thinking about it right now, there may not be any executive board members on those boards There may be, though, advisory board, because that's such a broad net. Advisory is like 160, 170 members, so it pretty much takes in most of the
About as many
population.
people as the light rail system was going to carry.
I would, yeah, all day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but no, the people that came together, for instance, in the Uptown, what we did was we put together our own money to do a study to jumpstart a major investment study, and we're following the major investment study guidelines so that what we do and spend on this process is not lost if we're able to generate the necessary enthusiasm to carry on through. And so for that reason, the people who run the hospitals, for instance, they're there because they're the big players in Uptown, and the Health Alliance Group, and the neighborhood council, Tony, he's there. So no, none of these are board members. In fact, most of these people are from private or quasi-private. So that's interesting. On the Western Corridor, I'm not sure what the makeup is, but there's 10 people there. So you can have a lot of influence on these boards early on.
Wendell's point, just very briefly, Wendell's point's excellent though. In Minnesota, to the chagrin of many people, the fact is the governor appoints the whole Metro Council. That's a fact. And the smart ones have figured that out, and they just go right to the governor. And believe me, we're an agency in the administration under the governor. We're not quite a state agency, although for all intents and purposes we look like one, where we quack and walk like a duck, so we're a duck. But we hear from the governor's office. When they hear from someone who's contacted them, mad or sad, happy or not, we hear directly from the governor's office, and if they're looking for a response, at least the response is it's a priority. So they figured that out, that the accountability back to the public is through the governor. Whether he likes that role or not, I'm not saying, because he's not the one that invented it, but he's the one. So if nothing else, by digging a little bit and finding that out, that chain, and then also figuring out that governor's offices usually have staffs of their own, and who isn't on the staff of the governor that really is the one that does the communication. All of this is ascertainable. It's just not hanging out there on the line sometimes, and you got to dig for it. I guess the thing I've become convinced of, though, is that if you got the will and the time, which I don't take for granted, you don't have to be a professional lobbyist to figure this stuff out. I just want to make that point.
Or you mean if
I
they
was
can
gonna-
figure it out, you can figure it out?
Yeah, if they figure it out, you can figure it out.
I was going to give an example of one vivid example of how some of this grassroots lobbying really worked on something, on a big policy issue, not transit, but to show that you can really, even when people think they've made up their minds and even committed themselves in such a way that they can't change their minds, that really you can change and impact government. And this is really just dovetails with what I've been saying about the calls, the letters, the applying pressure through the electoral process. The state of Iowa, I'm forgetting the name of the governor at the time, is a right-to-work state currently. They're a state that doesn't have compulsory unionism. If you're familiar with the Taft-Hartley Act, they've repealed that at the state level. The teachers' unions there, though, wanted to circumvent and wanted to really bring back the Taft-Hartley Act to increase union membership and their clout and power and all that sort of stuff. But they did it in a very creative way. What they did was they said nobody has to join the union. There's no problem with that. But all promotions and salary increases come through the union advisory board. And if you don't get the heads up from the union, then you don't get promotions and salaries. So of course you don't have to join the union, but you have to join the union.
Right.
So the governor had, under pressure from the teachers, had said that if the legislature passes it, I'll sign it into law, and I will not veto this bill. National Right to Work, if anybody knows or heard of the organization, they're organized specifically on this issue. They have, on average, about 5,000 constituents in each congressional district around the country. That being said, once they tried to stop this through the legislature, but it just got railroaded through the legislatures. And it was going to the desk of the governor to pass. They ignited they've got a call station, phone bank that they run, and they blitzed calls into their people into the state of Iowa, telling them that the sky is falling, you have to call the governor. Well, they blitzed the governor's office with phone calls. And they kept blitzing the governor's office with phone calls, and it shut down the governor's office. They couldn't call out, and every time they pick up the phone, they're like, "Stop! Don't vote!" And they click, like, "What is this? This is crazy." That being said, the governor contacts Right to Work and says, "You call off your dogs, or I will sign this bill into law today." And then they're like, "Oh, well, I guess we're doing a good thing." So they increased their calls, and they kept calling and kept calling. It actually, the transformer, true story, transformer that routed phones into the governor's office overheated, exploded, and there were no more phone calls that were coming into the governor's office. It totally shut down the governor's office. The governor was terrified, and after about a week of was he going to sign with? He actually vetoed the bill, and he called later on. Before he vetoed the bill, he called Mark Mix, who's the head of Right to Work, and said, "Mark, I have to give it to you guys. That was just probably the best orchestrated grassroots effort I've ever seen. I'll tell you what. I'll veto this bill if you guys can give me support on, I forgot what it was, something else. But it didn't have anything to do with their mission, as their people focus on that, and to get them to do whatever was this other thing, their people probably wouldn't care. So they said, look, that's not what we do. We care about this. We'll help you, in your election, because if you do the right thing, but we're not going to help you on other issues. And so they didn't even do that, and the governor still vetoed the bill. And this was after he publicly said, "I'm going to do it. It's going to be signed into law." It was after it was passed both houses and they defeated it. So at the local level, even on this, if this can work for the governor of a state, this can work for a mayor, it can work for a commission, it can work at any level, and know that the government employees unions do this so well. I mean, you'd think, going to the state of Virginia, state capital, you would have thought that everyone wanted higher taxes in the state of Virginia, but everybody who showed up, they're like, the newspaper was like heaping sums of people, converge on Capitol, and all these people, and you find out, it's like the teachers, government, the teachers unions, the public employees unions of all sorts were there. That's okay. Obviously, the guy who's going to get the raise from the tax increase is going to be there supporting it. So, but it still has influence on people. So there's ways to use those powers for good rather than evil.
Oh, right.
I had a question with you, John. I'm from Gainesville, Florida.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
I went to the University of Florida.
Go Gators.
Yeah. Really?
Yes. And I'm on a commission for Governor Bush on Affordable Housing Commission here
cool.
in Florida. But in Gainesville, as you know from experience, we're a very liberal town.
Yeah.
Very. And I am on a few committees and things like that in Gainesville. And one of the things I'm noticing, in fact, I brought one of our city commissioners here to this function.
I'm glad you did.
Ed Brady, you probably met him.
Yeah, I just met him. I was like, I can't believe you're from Gainesville.
Yeah. But just to get a point, though, is what I'm seeing in local government, which is really, really the grassroots of everything, is that being as liberal as we are, we've gotten some Republicans that are more conservative and open-minded. But I'm seeing that when we have these elected officials that are in office now, we're having a lot of problem with staff. Trying to get them out of office. And that's, to me, is where the real grassroots is. It's not the elected officials. It's the undercurrent of staff that is tearing up our community, and I'm sure a lot of communities.
In North Carolina.
How do we handle that? Because, I mean, we had one of his partners, they both came in at the same time, and he lost by 40 votes to get reelected. And what it ended up, we found out through that election, was that it was staff that was undermining the whole election, because we had to go to a runoff election in March,
Yeah.
you know, which is awful anyway. But how can we do that as grassroots?
Can I ask right off the bat, just as a point of information, who appoints the staff within Gainesville city government and then their
Well,
if you know?
we have, we have the,
Like, okay, go on.
go ahead, no.
I was just gonna.
City managers, and we have all that,
Okay.
that type of thing.
Okay, so
We
city
have
manager government,
in the
that's right.
county, we have a no growth, I call him a no growth,
Zealot.
growth management, but he's no growth. He was
Yeah, because they got the urban bound.
Yeah, we
Yeah, I
just,
know that.
that's in the lawsuit right now in Tallahassee, because our comprehensive land use plan, we're still working on 2000. Because of what they were trying to do, it would have been the worst comprehensive land use plan in the state of Florida.
No, I believe it.
Which is all no growth.
Yeah.
Zero growth.
Yeah.
Zero. And,
They won't even allow, I also know they won't even allow other municipalities to form within the adjacent area,
that in
which
North
is,
Carolina.
which is so that they control a monopoly of government, so there isn't another government that can say, well, we'll allow development.
Exactly.
And that's
they're going into other counties, which is, again, the avenues that everybody's talking about.
from a grassroots perspective, the suggestion that we do, and I'll try to connect this to the local level. This is a problem at every level of government. In Congress, you're only as conservative or as liberal as your staff.
Exactly.
And staff always work against members, almost always. And I'll tell you, a lot of times it's because staff, for a candidate who had a tough race, the staff was their campaign staff. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between the campaign people and the policy people. And the campaign people are more obsessed with actually authority and not good policy. And the policy people don't know how to win campaigns. That being said, the key is to get, as a grassroots movement, to recruit a candidate that's committed and then convince him to get committed staff, like on his campaign. And that doesn't mean at the local level that these are volunteers almost always, but he has to be surrounded with, now if you've started a grassroots movement and you've got volunteers and you've got a membership list, this is easier to do, okay? Because you're going to surround this fellow, the people that put him in office will be from your people. And that being said, those people are typically the people that get the patronage jobs, so to speak, in a pejorative sense. But they're the people that get hired as staff in congressional offices or chief of staffs at any sort of level. You look in the president's cabinet, governor's office, state reps, state senators. It's no coincidence that their campaign managers are their chief of staffs.
Well, when you're dealing with a town council on a small level, it's similar.
Yeah,
It would be similar for Kerry. It's a wave of sentiment against this anti-growth stuff.
Yeah.
Swept out a mayor who had put in a town manager who had hired all these staff to direct everything to no growth.
Yeah.
So they were ruined.
Yeah.
And then this new mayor comes in and he says, we're in financial trouble, we're going to change everything, and he would be more amenable to our position on this stuff, but he's a neophyte, and he comes in, and the manager's already there, the staff's already there, they're corrupted.
He could remove them.
How do you get that accomplished? How do you get rid of these people?
It's a good question. Let me give you a little different perspective. It's important to know the level of government you're dealing with and how they're structured. One I'm very familiar with because it's prevalent here in Minnesota at the local level, not counting Minneapolis, St. Paul. Okay, they have older, arcane types of government, but by and large, most of the municipalities in Minnesota, for example, have what's called the council manager form. And if you dig into the state law and or local charters, you'll find a couple interesting things. The city manager, or whatever their title, city administrator sometimes, is the one who is charged with hiring all the rest of the staff, and often is protected, at least in language, that the policymakers shall not micromanage is essentially what the law says.
Exactly.
Now, whether that always plays out that way is another issue, but the bottom line is, he or she is the one person that can be removed at
At the discretion of the mayor.
At the discretion, well, of the city
Of the
council.
council.
City council, right.
And if they're a 5-person council, you're looking at 3 votes, but I've seen this happen, and that's the way you get to that head administrative person. Then you have other complexities though. And before I list them, the one point I want to make, don't always assume the mayor unilaterally has that power, despite
No.
our perception of what mayors are. Many of them have become figureheads and are just one member of
Definitely.
5 or
States
7
of North
or
Carolina.
whatever.
Strong mayor, weak mayor.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to demean them, I'm just saying they aren't as authoritarian as you maybe like them to be sometimes, or maybe you wouldn't like them to be, but they aren't necessarily the chief executive. The other thing, though, is it's unfortunate in some respects that what locks in some of this staff complement, depending on the level you're at, are not only unions, but what I'll call, for lack of a better term, civil service.
Right.
Things like that where short of cause,
The APA.
it's hard, well, short of cause, though, it's hard to get rid of an employee. But there are ways, though, that if you get a majority, and this is a challenge in itself, but if you can get a majority on that city council and start setting specific policy and directives, then the way, it takes time though, if the staff continues to fight that and go against that grain, well, then they're setting themselves up for a fall because they're not performing like they should. It's very complex and it doesn't happen overnight, but the thing is figure out what kind of government structure you have and then find out who is the person that can be removed on a vote, and usually it's the chief executive.
But what about,
In Gainesville, the city manager can be removed on a majority vote, right? I know he's
Sure,
appointed.
that's how
so we-
generally would
I
work.
mean, how generally, but
Yeah.
but what about,
it's getting the majority, I'm sorry.
In Gainesville, the problem is the majority.
Majority is, likes what they're doing, and the minority is,
Yeah,
Everybody rides their bicycle.
well, what
Everybody
about
what?
using?
Everybody rides their bicycle. to
If Ed
the
Brady,
council
if Ed
meeting.
Brady can win in Gainesville, other people can win in Gainesville. That's
and he only won by 53 votes or whatever.
Oh, yeah, I
No,
remember,
it was a close election.
It was close.
The concern you've addressed, that I'm speaking to, is where you literally feel that you have a staff that's run amok and it actually has become a political force in itself.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
the key. If it's just a matter of setting policy and so on, then of course aim right at the elected officials, because they're
Right.
the ones
Right.
that are not getting.
Well, I
getting
think,
done.
I'm just saying, I think what's happening now is that the staff, head staff, more than anything, is so comfortable with what they have now because they got rid of a Republican, even though it's a nonpartisan race, is I see now, I'm listening to because I listen to the meetings all the time.
Yeah.
I guess I gotta get into life, but anyway, it fascinates me. I'm a very political junkie. But I see now that some of the guard is down when the staff, the head staff is giving reports to the commission on what they're using the word me now instead of I can see a change in their attitude that they're starting to take more control instead of giving it to the commission or the committee to make the decisions. They're really pushing for like development authority and things like that to not let them do their job that they're appointed to do. Or
Hating
One
to
of-
hear
one
the
of the
words,
other-
staff recommends.
yeah, exactly.
One of the other problems that arises too, and there's no good answer to this, is, I've been around unfortunately a long time. Institutional capture of good people occurs, you can bet that if we can get elected to boards or appointed to boards, half of the people, the right people, will go south on this very quickly. Given as an example, the first of the Denver Light Rail lines. You may remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Terry Considine, who ran for Senate back about 1990 in Colorado. Great guy. The point is, one of his staffers, anti-rail, good conservative, runs for the Rapid Transit District Board in Denver and provides the winning vote 2 years later for the first light rail line. Why? Because he brought, for him it was political power. We've seen this all over the time. And on the other hand, you'll have, the Ronald Reagan types who go to Washington and leave Washington no different than they came to Washington. So you really have to watch that.
And that's why it's important to, as a grassroots organization, to have the stick and the carrot. You have to always reinforce the good. Like a person does a good vote, you get your people to call and say, "We're watching. I want you to know that was a great vote." And when you're always reinforcing good behavior and punishing bad behavior, you're able to get the dog to do what you want him to do. So there has to be both, and there has to be constant contact that way.
Yeah, because these people, I imagine the time staff has spent with you trying to convince you of truth, as it were. It's been incredible.
They don't even talk to me about those things. They just all they do, what you learn very quickly, and I've alluded to this a number of times, and this is way
Trying to
off
box
topic.
you out, probably.
Is it? No, there were meetings about this when I came in, and I've been told by people who are friendly with me that there was a lot of consternation. So holding your cards and not saying much is a good thing, but the being from the transit board allows you a tremendous amount of leverage where we may only be 2% of the ridership or less. Our leverage is well disproportionate to our total amount of ridership.
Patrick, a couple of things. One, regarding MPOs, and I speak as a staff person on MPO, although I'm not going to mention in the session here which one. I'll be glad to tell you afterwards because I do not represent them here. One thing is state DOTs, and you mentioned ODOT. The state DOTs at the MPO where I work have a lot of influence. Now, the state DOT people that come to MPO meetings work for the state DOT. In some cases, they are accepted service. They're not civil servants. They serve at the pleasure of the Secretary of Transportation or the governor. So there is influence that way if you want to the MPO through the state DOT. So communicating with the governor or with the Secretary of Transportation is probably not a bad way to go. Another thing which I believe very strongly is that staff does not set policy. That is not staff's job. Staff can maybe make recommendations and say we might suggest this and this and put it before the policy people, which is usually the MPO board.
Yeah.
And in some cases that's done
Rubber stamp.
in some cases it does indeed get rubber stamped, but staff should not be setting policy. In some cases, probably a good staff may offer several alternatives. Another thing is there was before our MPO board, within the past year, an extremely controversial project, an extremely controversial highway project. The first large highway project added to our long-range plan and transportation improvement program in many, many, many years. The written comments sent by mail, as you said, or by email, or in some cases even by postcards churned out by the Sierra Club, even though that should not really influence the MPO board. Those were very carefully tallied, and they were all provided to the MPO board. What happened, the way it worked is the postcards were counted, and then the board was told, okay, we got 120 of these. The individual letters were all duplicated and given each one of them. Each one of the individual sort of custom letters, if you will, was given to the board. Another good reason to do a custom letter. Those things, that was definitely watched. And even though this major highway project was in one of the 3 states that make up this MPO, it's like where the MPO that Stefan serves on, there are 3 states there. And there were comments coming from the 2 states that were not really involved in this as well. So they definitely watch out for things like that.
Well, yeah, we have to count those numbers, and they keep very careful tabulation. When we have our meetings, our quote information meetings, where they're out selling the, as it were in the past, the rail project,
Right.
and they go out and do that, they would count very carefully the name of the individual that attended and how many people showed up. 8 people showed up that night, and they go out and set up an information meeting, and 8 people show up, and they count the 8th number and come back, and we would be presented with all the numbers. So their responsibility. And in fact, when the federal government comes in, they do an audit of us.
That's
And they
right.
require careful documentation of these meetings, how many were held, how many people showed up. And you have to produce all this data, just like any kind of an audit would. Only here you're counting heads and numbers and cards.
A couple other things that the federal government requires MPOs to have some sort of public participation process.
Well, that's
Use that to your advantage. Our MPO, and I think we're in a couple of other MPOs that I have had occasion that adjoin ours, that neighboring MPOs, they have public comment periods at the beginning of the board meeting. And typically people are limited to 2 minutes. The chairman can change that. For instance, if there's 50 people to speak there, that's a lot of time taken out of the meeting. But typically it's 2 minutes. But if you're careful, you can use a good pithy 2-minute delivery to, get people maybe at least to think about what they're saying, about what you're saying, and also the media is often there, and the people that I've seen this, the people that delivered good 2-minute comments, the Washington Post reporter, and now I'm betraying where I work, I'm going to say it anyway, the Washington Post reporter will come up.
Seattle.
Well, yeah.
Post intelligence.
They will come up and talk to the people that have the boring, bang on the head type comment. The Post reporters basically they don't pay any attention to that. But that's something that you should think about. Also, they do indeed where the rubber hits the road is certainly in committees. And they're all a little different, depends, I won't speak about one versus the other, but there are committees. And there are some committees that are probably going to be, for instance, probably more inherently friendly to highway improvements. A good case in point of that is an MPO where I don't work, but I have familiarity with it. They have a freight movement committee. Well, I can be fairly certain that a light rail line, that's not going to benefit UPS or Federal Express or even the mom and pop drayage companies that maybe deliver air freight from the airports, even though the city council of Tacoma Park wants to deliver their air freight by light rail. In spite of that, that's not going to happen. And so there's a venue where you might be able to, you might have some friendly, friendly reception. And then finally, these committees, in my experience, the Sierra Club and their friends have recruited people to come to all of these meetings. They don't necessarily participate in the meetings, they do occasionally, but they then report back to the sort of to the spider in the middle of the web, and so forth. And that goes on, that's very, very common, and you should be aware of that. Now, if you have a position that is not that of the Sierra Clubs, you might, maybe if you have somebody who's interested who is retired, probably is probably the best person. If you have a retiree, you can go to these meetings just to be your eyes and ears, because they do take place during business hours, during business days. And if you have a real job, it may be difficult for you to go to them. It behooves you to do that. And then also, and finally, don't forget about that a lot of this stuff is published on the internet. If they should be publishing a fair amount of this stuff there, which means that you can look at it at your convenience. And with that, I'll shut up.
What you'll normally find is the cities that think that they're going to deliver air freight with light rail are also places you can be sure that there will never be any nuclear material.
Nor Gainesville.
It seems to, and I have a general belief that all these public servants, even staffers, generally want to do good. And their definition of good is the things that get pressed on them. We're getting congestion, and we have people I know are getting hurt by congestion, and we need to get them to work better. And then the proposals that they see are light rail, so they sit there and say, well, this must be something we can do that's different than what we're doing right now. And so a lot of momentum gets picked up off of that. It seems to me that staff is just like elected officials. If you send a bunch of taxi cab company owners to a board meeting and say, you'll kill my 15 employees if you pass this light rail in this area. You'll hurt, and those business owners ought to be willing to, if we organize their time correctly, ought to be able to go in there and say, this is how it affects my employees. Now all of a sudden you're putting in a weight into this thing that
Yeah,
makes
very
sense
well.
to where you're hurting people. You got to get an emotion.
Yeah.
People decide on emotion or act on emotion and justify with reasons.
Yeah, but I would only, and I think you're right, except I think you need to be careful to understand that these people that are making these decisions are not making their own decisions.
Right.
They're making decisions based upon billions of dollars that is coming out of Washington.
Yes.
I
Well,
mean,
and state government.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, if we wanted to win, if we wanted good transportation in this country, the first thing we would do is shut down the Federal Transport
Yes.
Well,
Administration.
I want to privatize things. How do we get to privatize it? That's
Well,
what I want to
that's-
know.
We're a ways from that.
Unfortunately, MPOs don't have a lot to say about that.
Well, we're going to have to, we've only got a few more minutes, but that's a big, maybe we ought to talk about that next year. That's a big subject.
Thank you, that would be great.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think
talk
you
about
need
it.
to look at, sorry,
Oh, yeah.
comment. I think you need to look at what they've done in Britain with the British rail system. And again, it's not local transit. And I think they have done a lot of actually local transit privatization.
Well, there are marvelous examples of transit privatization around the world. The whole world is going in that direction and very successfully.
Yes.
The problem is that the most anti-market economy in the world with respect to public services is right here.
right
That's right.
And the Berlin Wall is falling is actually less remarkable than the fall eventually of the bureaucratic system of the United States, in my view.
Absolutely.
You know, I've heard what you've said about elected officials happily going south on you after you get them elected, and also the frustration of dealing with the staff. And I want to offer you an observation that I really haven't heard at the conference, and that is that your issues may be undermined by people who you think are your friends.
Absolutely.
I'll give you an example of this. I sponsored a law that in my own county, King County, Seattle, that would provide certain dates for people that were applying for permits for small projects, for things like, you know, decks, remodels, if you're going to put in a house or two. And I felt that it was a good law. It was something that was going to help the small builder, the small property owner. And my biggest adversary was the Master Builders Association. The Master Builders Association was very busy organizing at the grassroots all of these various property rights advocates. And they were supposedly on their side and supporting them. But privately, with my staff and with my council, they were undermining this law. In fact, they managed to excise that language. Now, I was able to get that language put back in by calling it the way it was. I have a client right now, a whole series of clients that are small property owners on a major arterial. And these are small people that have been operating these businesses for years and years. And there's the transportation planners are wanting to change this corridor, turn it into a mass transit kind of a corridor, and put in, you know, eliminate the left turn lanes and, you know, just basically kill these small businesses off. And the people that are doing it, the people that are leading this, are the development industry and the master builders and the Building Industry Association, who are supposedly the friends of these small business people, who see that this is an opportunity to drive those small property owners off of their land and allow them to consolidate the parcels and sell them to large, globally connected, you know.
Yes, you do have to think about who you think is actually supporting
And
it.
so the thing I'd like to plant in your fertile minds is that your natural constituency looks a little more like that small neighborhood activist, or the person that lives in town that does business in the local community, who maybe isn't crazy about a lot of development and really wants to protect the environment, but they also respect and welcome reasonable development from small builders, small property owners, people that are local folks, locally homegrown folks. And maybe some connections there in the long run will be more politically potent than jumping into, you know, I mean, the Farm Bureau has been known that the Farm Bureau does not speak for tens of thousands small and moderate farmers. And so too, the building industry associations don't speak for a lot of these small property owners. But it's just a different way of thinking.
Right.
Maybe next year there might be some discussion about that.
Good.
I think it also depends on the type of metro area you're talking about. Some metro areas are saturated with production home builders, and others are not.
Well, every locality though is if it reaches a certain size where the marketplace is attractive, then these groups are, these companies are going to swoop on in with that. And those small builders are the ones that pay the price.
Yeah, good. Well, we have, I think we're about finished here. Any other last conclusions? Thank you very much. Good panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.